I'm interested in how long your residency at the rooms was supposed to be and how long it ended up being. And did the increase in the length of time in any way impact your work or your process? So there's your question to begin, and we'll just also, let's do one of these.
Jenny, may I have you stand over here?
Just right here, just so we're being followed.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. So to answer Anne's question, my residency started last February, so pretty much a year ago. It was only supposed to be 3 months. So I was here February into March, got accepted to grad school, and then the next day the pandemic kind of like came to town and got kicked out of the studio. I lived just down there on Garrison Hill, so I was kind of like sitting in my kitchen, like looking up at the rooms, like longing for the space and the chance to be here. And then in June, they let me come back, fortunately. So then I kind of got to continue the work, and it was just crunch time and kind of like a rush to just get it done and say what I wanted to say. And it really did impact the work. I got more of a chance to give it more thought, which I didn't know was possible. I thought I could only think to a certain point, but I had the opportunity to just think about it as much as I possibly could and spend as much time as I could hashing it out and even taking risks in terms of the sculptural works. You can see probably never would have happened if it weren't for the pandemic. I kind of came back with a vigor and a more of a, I guess you could say, like rage or anger about this kind of the state of the world, and I figured why not take some risks and make some strange things for the space. So I just want to start by asking if anyone here has ever been to Labrador City or if they know about Labrador City. For a show of hands.
Wow.
Cool. What do you guys know about it?
You have a long, cold winter.
Yeah, that's true. So I was born in Labrador City, and I grew up there, not spending much time away from Labrador City. It's a very isolated, cold, kind of strange place that popped up in the 60s, entirely based around a very valuable body of iron ore that runs very deep into the ground. So yeah, it popped up in the 60s. It's very close to the border of Quebec. I'm not sure the politics around why it's Labrador and why it's not Quebec. But that was always kind of an interesting thing growing up, was this closeness to Quebec, but also the population being widely from Newfoundland was kind of like situated us as culturally adjacent to Newfoundland, while kind of lacking the landscape of Newfoundland and of course the ocean. Labrador City is very inland and nowhere near the ocean, so it was, I think I found myself struggling to find a culture for myself as like the first generation person to grow up in Labrador City. So I think the project started as maybe an attempt to craft a visual culture for where I come from. So what you can see around you is an attempt, at least, at that. The project started before I even knew it. This photo over here I took when I was about 13 or 14. Scanned at Walmart and printed it from that JPEG. So yeah, this project has been ongoing for probably 10 years. Even before I knew that it would ever happen. So growing up, I didn't really have an awareness of the mine and what that system was, and how the mining industry works. I really was ignorant to it because I was focused on being a kid and being a teen, and then university, and then by the time I left, I started to understand that it was kind of a bizarre place to live and to experience kind of like total dependence on that kind of industry. So I really had no idea the scale of the mines until I started to work there 2 years into university. They offer the opportunity for students to take a job in the mine, which is like a blessing financially. So my dad has worked at the mine for over 30 years as a millwright in what's called the concentrator, which is a section of the processing plants where they extract everything that isn't iron from the product. And you can see on the sculpture it's actually covered in the iron ore concentrate. Labrador City is can be a kind of polarizing place where you have this attitude between corporate and union workers, and I tried to illustrate that in this drawing here, which is of a strike shack. And my dad was actually on strike when I was born, and he has been about 5 or 6 times since then. So there's always this tension around, labor rights and corporate versus union, and it's quite complicated. So when I finally got the chance to see the mine after 18 or 20 years of not knowing anything about it, I was totally amazed at the scale of the open pits. It's just unimaginable. If you look at the harbor, it's about one pit is about the size of the harbor and as deep as the harbor. It's so hard to wrap my head around, and it took me 2 summers to really understand the process of mining, and I just thought that it was so absurd that, as humans, like we're so small, we feel so insignificant as individuals, but when we kind of team up, we can cause like this kind of gross destruction of the landscape and kind of excessive need to extract like whatever we can. Like it's kind of like we're grasping at the earth to just like take whatever we can get in the most large amounts possible. And my job at the mine was to drive a 300-ton truck, which is about as wide and as tall as this room that we're standing in. And that truck can haul about 350 tons of ore, or not just ore, but rocks and dirt. And it's a very repetitive and isolating job. And I found that the experience of doing that job really mirrored my experience of growing up in Labrador City, feeling isolated and alone and kind of separated from everything else. I'd often talk to my friends and coworkers about how, it felt like we could be on another planet, or we could look out into the mine and it could just be anywhere in the world, because it's such a stark, like industrial landscape, and it's so void of, not to be depressing, but it's so void of anything that would ever kind of bring you pleasure or enjoyment. So I think a lot of my time working there was spent like desperately trying to find something that I could find beautiful. I think it was like a last-ditch effort to get through it. Something like it felt like a promise of a sunset or a sunrise, or if we were lucky, like the northern lights would kind of felt like it carried me through. It's like we're taking from the land in a totally corporate way, but then to just survive, we're taking from it in another way could be spiritual or very profound. So I guess that was kind of like the driving force to make the work. And I had so many fears of it being depressing or dark, but I think that there's kind of no way around it. It's just you can't just avoid those aspects of life. When I was working in the mine, I started to understand my dad's position and it really touched me. I really had no idea, where he went when he left the house every day, and I didn't know where he came from when he came home. Over there on that plinth, well, I'll turn your heads, I have his lunch can, which I messaged him one day and said, would you pick me up a lunch can from the local supply store? Because I just think it's quite symbolic of a working class object. And he was like, well, why don't I just give you mine? And I never thought that would, I didn't want to take his lunch can. It's his most kind of it's like his tool, it's like what I would see on the kitchen counter every day before he went to work. So when he offered to give it to me, it was quite emotional. And I had it in my studio for a long time, covered up in a blanket, because I just, it was just so, I don't know, it just really touched me to look at it, and I could barely, keep it together looking at it. So I just think of my dad and his father and his family, and I see this this tendency or just instinct to survive. My dad's father worked in a mine, as well as 5 of his brothers. And that makes me a 3rd-generation mine worker. So I just, it's quite profound to think about it, but really instilled in me this idea of just hard work and survival and kind of not having another choice. Wildlife also kind of fills the mind, like evicted tenants, kind of, who don't want to leave. So again, it comes back to this beast. Every morning in the pits, we see this colony of foxes that it's almost like they had planned to disperse themselves through each pit. So it's like this large network of pits. So in each individual pit, we'd see one fox sitting next to the machinery. And you can imagine a massive truck and a tiny animal sitting next to it fearlessly and staring into the cab and kind of just looking you in the eyes, hoping that you throw it a bone or throw it a morsel of whatever your lunch was. And I just kind of had this comparison between the animal that had been, had its habitat stripped from it, and the mine worker itself. It's kind of this complicated balance of living in a place and having no other choice and being implicated in the process, and while at the same time kind of being in charge and power and wealth, kind of all lined up with that idea of the balance between a helpless animal and kind of the industry that rules us. So that's kind of where that came from. And if you can see, you could probably all turn your heads and see this cloud right here. That's the cloud that hovers above the mine processing plant. So you can see that from kind of any point in town. And as a child, I kind of had this idea that my dad was just endlessly just pumping out a cloud. That's what he did at work, was make the cloud happen. And yeah, I guess the work feels like something I've needed to get off my chest. It feels like I had to get this out of me, for me to move on and find something else to talk about. So yeah, I mean, that's basically the idea around it. It's been difficult work to make. Again, the residency was stretched on kind of into oblivion. There were points where I thought the show just felt like it would never happen. It was supposed to open on the weekend, and then there was a snowstorm, and I pushed it 4 days later, and it just almost felt natural that the work be delayed in every single way possible, because it's so wrought with frustration and complexities, and it's hard for me to kind of fully explain it because it's such a, obviously where you come from is always a complex kind of situation, and it's just my attempt to grapple with the politics of extraction and the impact that that has on a culture, on a social culture. I would feel so frustrated at work. I started to understand kind of like the endless role of capitalism. I felt that I would never have to like pick up a book on the subject because I was like had this firsthand experience as like the lowest rung on the ladder of mine worker as a truck driver. It was just like the ultimate depiction of capitalism and excess, and it's just such an unrelenting system. It just won't stop. And again, to make another dark point is like, the mine doesn't stop. Like it's 24/7. It never ends unless like somebody's killed on the job. That's the only reason that the mine would shut down. So I think these ideas are just in the back of my head, and although the mine and the rocks in the ground have provided like beyond belief for myself and my family and my grandparents and my uncles, it's also about strife and struggle and just an unrelenting system, and it's can be quite devastating. I remember there was a day where they had just opened a new section of the mine where I had spent a lot of time as a child picking blueberries and hiking, and we were digging it up. We were putting dynamite in the ground and blowing it up, and to have a hand in it felt so wrong, but also to feel so helpless. It's such a difficult thing to describe, that feeling of having a hand in what feels like the opposite of art, or the opposite of beauty is the destruction of it, and to be like, felt like the whole thing was on my back. Like it felt like those 300 tons of rocks were like I could carry it on my own shoulders. That's how it felt, was to watch the landscape that I held so close to my heart like be destroyed, and to have a hand in it is just a very difficult thing to grapple with. So yeah, this is my attempt to depict that. And I've also made a book, which I've been working on for the past 2 years. It's not in the gift store yet, it's still in production. And I think the book is a little more of an intimate, personal description of all of this. It's hard to, it's so difficult to like bear your ideas and your thoughts in a way that's like in a room. Like I had such a difficult time visualizing what it would look like once it was in the space, until I got in here and I started to think like, oh, what if we did this, or what if we did this? Or a lot of things that happened ended up being impulsive, and I think like that's the fun of it, is being able to take risks and make things that are impulsive and kind of fun and strange, and so I hope you all are interested in the work, and I really thank you so much for coming today. It really means a lot to me.